Hey TCSTV viewers, it's Evelyn coming to you live from the camera store, and we are very excited because tonight we are launching a photography book by George Weber. It's his latest title. It's called Borrowed Time, Calgary, 1976 to 2019. And this is an intriguing exhibition of documentary photographs of our hometown right here, Calgary, Alberta. And it's a very interesting and complicated look at what the city is really like, the people, the places, the sights. And it's over 40 years of history in this book. And it's going to give us a glimpse through George's lens of some of these fleeting moments and places that are experiencing the fragility of time. Before I welcome George, I want to thank some of our event sponsors for making this virtual book launch happen. Of course, to Rocky Mountain Book Publishing, who's a publisher of this title, as well as many others that we carry at the camera store. And as our gift to all of the viewers tonight, we actually are going to offer 20% off all of our George Weber books. We carry, I think, all 10 of them now. And so if you order them online and you're in Canada, you can get the 20% off. And if your orders are over $100, we do free shipping across Canada, except for oversized or overweight items. But I also want to thank our partners at the Calgary Public Library for working on this event with us for quite a while. And in a moment, I'm going to be welcoming one of the Calgary Public Library's board members, Crystal Manyfingers, who is a published children's book author and is also a community bridge builder as a First Nation member of the Great Blackfoot Confederacy. So welcome, Crystal. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. And the camera store. I just want to say, okay, to everybody out there, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of George Weber's book, Borrowed Time on behalf of the Calgary Public Library. I want to start this evening with the land acknowledgement. The City of Calgary Library acknowledges the City of Calgary, which we Blackfoot people call Mohkinstsis. This is the lands where the Elbow and the Bow Rivers meet. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we recognize the ancestral territories, cultures, and oral practices of the Blackfoot people. The Ayaska, Stoney Nakoda Nation, the Dene people of the Tsuut'ina, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Calgary Public Library serves the community on this traditional land, and we honor all people who share, celebrate, and steward the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. This land acknowledgement reminds me of the histories of my people that precede Confederation of Canada. It highlights our responsibilities as we move forward and helps us bring us together on a shared journey of truth and reconciliation. Now, the library gives access to everybody to stories that entertain and instruct. It is a community hub where Calgarians can come online and in person to learn and share ideas through resources, programming, and other services. It is also a place that can help us to have a better understanding of ourselves and our neighbors. The Camera Store, our partner in this event, has helped Calgary and area residents tell their stories in a visual way for over 25 years. Now, George Weber is one of those people. George's book, Borrowed Time, which I'm really excited to read, preserves much of Calgary's recent past and immediate present through a colorful kaleidoscope of intimate glimpses. George's artful photographs spring from his affection for the people of the Canadian West. He is a recipient of numerous national and international awards, and his photographs can be found in museum collections across the globe. His books include Borrowed Time, Saskatchewan Book, Alberta Book, there's my dog, Badlands, Prairie Gothic, In This Place, Last Call, People of the Blood, A World Within, and Requiem. In 1999, George was elected to the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in recognition for his contributions to the visual arts in Canada. And in 2017, he was featured in A Story Hive documentary film titled Lost Horizons, The Photographs of George Weber. Thank you very much for having me. I will see you towards the end, and I'll turn it back over to Evelyn. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Crystal, and of course the entire board of the Calgary Public Library. They've always been such wonderful supporters, especially when working with George Weber. Whenever we mention his name, they're always 100% on board and willing to help us give the community an experience to be able to see his work. Now, if you're just joining us and you're not familiar with our main guest tonight, well, I can tell you that George Weber's name is basically a key fixture at the Camera Store. As Crystal and I mentioned earlier, we have 10 of his books that are on our bookshelves. And since his career that started in the early 1970s when he became more serious about photography, he became a globally recognized documentary photographer and has had countless exhibitions as well. And I'm absolutely honored to once again welcome George back to the Camera Store and to be able to have him join all of you at home tonight. So welcome, George. Thanks for joining us.
Great to see you, Evelyn. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
Welcome. So we have the TCSTV Live Dream team working behind the scenes to make all of this happen. And so a special thanks to them. We have the full team on deck tonight, and that is Drew, Gary, Chris, Riley, and Jeff. So we have full house of support. Everybody wanted to be here for you, George. But of course, the best part about going live and doing this virtual experience is being able to interact with all of you in some ways more so than we could with even an in-person event. So I do encourage all of you to put your questions to George in the chat. You can also email me if you're not logged into YouTube. It's Evelyn at thecamerastore.com, and put all those questions in. We'll get to them throughout. I have lots for you too, George. So why don't we get into just a little bit of history of how this book came to be your 10th title. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm enormously proud of the book, Evelyn, and really pleased. The folks at Rocky Mountain Books, especially art director Chyla Cardinal, did just an incredible job with the translation of the photographs onto the printed page to a printing plant all the way over in China, right? And the fact that we got the book back here as well in these COVID times was kind of a miraculous piece of logistics. But I'm really pleased and proud of it. Calgary has, I have a great affection for the city, and over the years I've, it's been my home, for many years. And I never tire of packing my camera, one of the ones I bought from you guys, throwing it over my shoulder, and then just walking through, especially some of the perhaps overlooked parts of the city, parts that people don't think of, in the tourism brochures and that sort of thing. And I've been blessed over the years to have encountered many extraordinary people that have shared stories, and there's places within the city as well that I have great affection for. And as you've referenced, it's what you're holding in your hands there is the sort of legacy of 43 years of little strolls and little moments and little adventures around the city.
Now, over the years, I've heard of people talking about your work as almost a way of collecting some of these vulnerable places and objects and people and things that almost are these fleeting moments that have a risk of going away or not being seen anymore. Can you talk a little bit about why it's specifically important to you to capture some of these things that, might not always be the obvious thing to photograph, but some of these little details that happen within our city of Calgary?
Yeah, well, I was really fortunate. As a boy, I grew up in Drumheller, Alberta, and I used to go exploring the Badlands with my grandfather, Frank Weber. And, we found some incredible stuff, and just that sort of desire to sort of look below the surface of things, to collect little artifacts from the past, that was a powerful influence and inspiration for me, even as a youngster. And I think that I've brought that sensibility. Sometimes things that people pass by, overlook, are not as aware of. I have kind of a keen appreciation of the ephemerality, especially, as you know, because of my impending 70th birthday here in February. And, many of the things that I photographed have disappeared. The city's changed a lot in the 43 years that are represented in the book. But I think I bring a kind of a heightened sense or an awareness of the fact of the ephemerality of things. And sometimes the most commonplace things, strangely, are the ones that are at greatest risk for disappearing. I think also that, when you collect a series of images over the course of many decades, I feel a little bit like an archaeologist or a paleontologist collecting little fragments that when they're collected in a book or in an exhibition, they tell you a lot about, the values, the history, the inspiration, aspirations, cultures, and just the shifts that a city goes through as they're played out in our common shared social environment, essentially.
Wonderful. And we're going to take a look at some of these photos very shortly. And before we do, I wanted to talk a little bit about your approach to photography, more so just how you present your work and how often in these books you don't necessarily spell it out. You don't say, like, this photograph here has this meaning behind it. I want you to look at these details. You really leave it up to the audience to make their own interpretation and get their own feeling from it, because I know myself as a Calgarian, I might have a very different perspective on it based on where I identify in a historical time period. Mm-hmm. And so can you just talk a little bit about why that's important to you, why you don't necessarily always spell out those details to the audience?
Well, I think my work might possibly be described as kind of a poetic approach to documentary. It's certainly documentary work. Which makes it different than photojournalists who are frequently addressing or telling a specific story. My work is really concerned with the daily, sometimes overlooked, as we were talking about earlier. And I think many of my favorite photographs, and I think many of the great photographs in the history of the medium, are ones which tell a story neat, simply, respectfully, and over the passage of time, little narrative elements or interpretations will attach themselves to those stories. And like as with a lot of art, I think that there's a role for the creator to bring to birth the photograph, but ultimately the uses of the photograph and the interpretations largely arise from the audience's, as you say, values, sense of history, connection to a place, and that sort of thing. And aesthetically, I've always been wedded to the idea of very simple, direct storytelling. As you know, I generally work with what's called a normal lens, or one that's very close to it, one which captures the subject that I'm photographing in a very neat, straightforward, undramatic manner. And I believe that is closer to a kind of deep truth, it's closer to a subtlety, and also I think it engenders a level of respect, because I don't think I have to get in there when I'm doing documentary work and dramatize with a lens or a light or a camera angle what I'm attempting to capture. I think the thing in and of itself, delivered neat, is worthy of our attention and respect. And I think that my own aesthetic sense is to withdraw, to tell stories simply, and to let the subject as much as possible speak, and to be an audience, to be receptive, to be listening to what the subject might have to share with me.
Wonderful. Well, let's take a look at one of the older photographs in your book. This is going to take us back to 1976, I believe, and it is a photograph, of course, in Calgary. Can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts were, what you can recall from when you captured this photograph?
Yeah, well, this is a great one to start with, Evelyn. In the mid-1970s, I stumbled upon a book by the great French street photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. And it was like a lightning bolt moment. It literally was transformative. I saw the book. When I closed the book, I knew more than anything else in the world I wanted to be a photographer, and that was in the mid-1970s. And I was really struck by his capacity to enter into the world and to very lightly, gently, gracefully enter into situations and not ruffle the waters at all, to do it very simply. This photograph was taken on one of my most cherished and hallowed hunting grounds, which is 8th Avenue in downtown Calgary, which really is the city writ large. It's one of our oldest major streets in the city of Calgary, home of beautiful architecture, the Hudson's Bay building among some of the significant ones. And it was just this idea that, I could walk out there with a camera with a 50-millimeter lens, and if I was observant, respectful, quiet, there were these wonderful little stories that could be harvested. There's this beautiful little interplay between these men in the foreground, the bus inspector glancing back, someone looking back over his shoulder, and then the gentleman selling the watchtower. So it's really, it's rich, but it's simple, and it captures a moment from when I first started doing this. And it was also, when I first started doing this, quite a challenge, because my nature is to be sort of reserved and introverted. So the idea of walking around and pointing a camera at strangers was a little bit of a leap for me.
Yes, well, and you could tell that, especially if you were, photographing with, as you say, a natural, focal length. You would have had to been at a fairly close distance to the people in order to capture this image. But I love the different layers, and as you say, there's different stories that are happening within the frame, but it complements itself very well. And one thing, just talking about like the history of some of these photographs, I mean, this is 1976, and so to me, this looks almost like a very iconic, stylish, these gentlemen, they look so dapper, and they're all wearing these great hats. And, I think sometimes we romanticize the past when we look at photographs from from decades previous, but all these things in human history are so fleeting, and it really changes quickly. If you were to walk downtown to Calgary now to the same place, the look of it would be completely different. And I think these are some of the details that the audience should really look for as we get into some of the images throughout these 4 decades of time that this book encapsulates. Maybe we can move to the next image here, which is another one from, what year is this one? This is also in the 70s, 1978.
Yeah, this is the another iconic, much loved, sadly missed now aspect of Calgary's cultural history. This is the Victoria Pavilion, and many of you will know of the Hart family. The Hart family they created this incredible legacy. There was a television program shot on black and white film called Stampede Wrestling that went all around the world. And I remember when I went down there to do these photographs, I'll share something kind of personal here with you.
Yes,
I'd recently been through sort of a little bit of a painful romantic episode in my life.
Oh.
And I was looking for something to get me out of my head, something that would just kind of, get me away from in the head and out into the world. And so I'd heard about Stampede Wrestling, and this is a kind of a gentle photograph, but it was a rough-hewn, sweaty, profane kind of a place, especially for a skinny white kid from suburban Calgary, right? And I was really entering into what was a pretty, for me, foreign, dangerous world in some respects, right? And it was the beginning of what for me has been a lengthy practice in my documentary career, Evelyn, is the yearning to enter into intimate and private spaces. And those have included, they started with the Victoria Pavilion. They extended to Hutterite colonies. They extended to the Blood, or what is now known as the Kainai First Nations Reserve, to inner city hotels where the drug and sex trade were thriving. So all of these sort of intimate, private, in some ways psychologically challenging places became catnip for me. And I had to test myself, push myself, but I had so many incredible experiences, and that yearning for a kind of an intimacy or entree into a place that, I might not otherwise have gained access to, I couldn't resist, because there was this thing on the front of my chest, usually a Leica or a Nikon, tugging me down into these places that I would have feared to have gone on my own, right?
Would you say that like the camera almost made you like this invisible cloak that gave you that courage?
Yeah.
And does it still?
Well, I would say, because there is something about seeing something, and then there's something about seeing it through a lens which gives you just a little bit more detachment when you're looking at it as a photographer. You're kind of analyzing things, thinking about how the raw material of life might be able to be hopefully artfully transformed into a photograph. But I'm also going to say that a huge influence for me was the work of master photographers. People like Cartier-Bresson, who I've mentioned, or Robert Frank. Mm-hmm. I was especially enamored of Deanne Arbus and Bruce Davidson, and I just marveled at their capacity to enter into places that you wouldn't have thought people could have gotten with cameras, and that really ignited and burnished my own curiosity about these places. But yeah, the camera can be a little bit of a leash. It can be a little bit of a shield. It can give you permission to perhaps stick your nose in the places that otherwise you might not have thought would be appropriate.
Yes, and actually this is a very good time to segue into this next photograph, which is a very intimate spot. And so in this photograph here, it's the St. Louis Hotel in 2006. So we're kind of fast forwarding a lot further ahead. Mm-hmm. But tell us about how you were able to capture this intimate location, this moment.
Yeah, and we're still looking at, images here, as I know you realize, Evelyn, shot on black and white film with a Leica camera. I went into the the St. Louis Hotel because I'd heard some story a number of years ago. And for people that aren't from Calgary, the St. Louis is part of a kind of an unholy trinity. There was the King Eddie, St. Louis, and Cecil hotels that were kind of the epicenter of the drug and sex and rough living trade in Calgary, in Calgary's East Village. The first time that I went into, the first day that I went into the St. Louis after getting permission, this gentleman was sitting at a table in the hotel, and he was watching me hawk-like through the night. And then at one point, he stood up, he walked over to me, he sort of walked me into a wall, and he said, "If you take that effing camera out, I'm going to shove it up your effing..." And he said, "Do you understand?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I understand." He continued to watch me, and then later in the night he called me over, and he's asked that I never use his name. I won't. It's just identified by initials in the book. He then felt compelled to tell me his story. He'd served in Vietnam. He shared some horrifying stories about things, and again, the intimacy of this, I was kind of shocked by and moved by what he had to tell me. You know, from an hour earlier when he wanted to stick my camera somewhere to an hour after that, he was telling me about when he was serving in Vietnam, and a contingent of his colleagues had gone through a village. They'd left wounded Vietnamese. He came in with several of his colleagues. He encountered a young, badly injured Vietnamese woman who begged him to put her out of her suffering. So he pulled out his service revolver and he killed her. Well, I was shocked. I mean, it was an act of mercy on one level, but it was a shocking thing to hear, and it was a shocking thing for me as a stranger to hear, right? We saw each other. He never wanted to be photographed, but at one point he called me up he said, "George, I'd like to come up to my room and do some photographs," right? Now, that's a kind of a dramatic thing, but there is something that I've learned over the years that I've done photography is people, when they feel safe and when they feel respected in your presence, will sometimes share things with you that are shocking, things that they wouldn't share with maybe the closest members of their family, perhaps. And that's a gift, you know, and that's a gift that I treat with the greatest of respect. So when I'm photographing, I'm very mindful of the intimacy and the sharing, and I respect the limits that I've been given when I'm photographing. And you know, there's situations where I've photographed with full permission and realized that those photographs were in some way potentially going to be harmful to the person that I photographed. Mm-hmm. Those get deleted. Those negatives get canceled, essentially, right? This is pretty sacred territory. And I don't say that it's me. It's part of my upbringing, my family. I think if you're going to identify one single thing, it's perhaps my mom's influence, her capacity for insight and empathy, kindness, openness to people around her. And I hope, as her son, I carry that legacy. And D.V. remembered or saw something, and he was very open to share this very, very intimate, fragile moment with me when I did the photograph.
Wow. The next photograph we have here really changes gears, and of course this is the cover photograph. It is so striking, and I think a lot of Calgarians obviously will recognize the location. It is at the Calgary Stampede in the summertime. If those don't know, it's basically a rodeo and a massive fair, lots of entertainment. It's sort of hot and sticky and colorful, and this photograph is so perfect in how it encapsulates that. I just love all the graphical elements that you have in here. I mean, the way that the giant donut frames the main subject, the little details. Can you tell us a little bit about the Calgary Stampede and why you like photographing this show, this crazy show?
Yeah, well, and you're right, Evelyn. This is the cover image, and with all of my books, again, I'm going to just reach out and thank art director Chyla Cardinal. Usually Chyla looks at, 200 photographs, and she picks out the one that's going to work. And I have to say, almost every time she picks out a photograph, I don't like it. I look at it and think, that's not the one I would have chosen. But then a couple of days go by, a week goes by, a month goes by, and I say, geez, yeah, she nailed it. She absolutely nailed it. And I think that's the case here. The Stampede is this, it's theater writ large in Calgary. It's this incredible event. Now, there is, of course, the Western tradition. There's the rodeo. There's the cowboys. There's the infield events. There's all that stuff. And that's an important part of the tradition, but with all due respect, I'm kind of not interested in that stuff, right? For me, it's what happens in the midway, the malls, essentially, basically, right? And so I'm getting an indication. Is my mic still good? Saying battery low here. Are we good? Thank you. Sorry. So it's just this theater, and the thing that is so phenomenal about it is you see young people, old people, new Canadians, old Canadians, First Nations, and everybody's relaxed, everybody's comfortable, everybody's communally sharing this beautiful, friendly, sexy, intimate thing. There's gorgeous women, beautiful kids, lovely old characters that you see. So I absolutely adore the Midway. That's my turf. Now, and even though you said earlier, and I generally do defer from sort of saying what a picture is about and means and that sort of thing, I'm just going to get you to cut me a little bit of slack on this particular one.
Absolutely.
Because I think the other thing, when I look at this photograph, is that I think it's kind of interesting, cool, colorful, all of the above, right? But it's, I think, potentially, it may, at some future point, prove to be a very significant and telling one. So what you see there is you see a large group of new Canadians on the left side of the frame. You see the man carrying it's a beautiful, sunny, clear, blue sky Calgary day. He's carrying this inflatable donut, probably made from petrochemical products, probably manufactured in China, probably shipped from China to Calgary, picked up at the Stampede grounds, carried around for perhaps that day, carted home, deflated by an errant child sitting on it, put into the recycle bin, and then, that irreplaceable petrochemical product has this very short and, you could say, kind of a trivial lifespan. And I'm not saying that, I'm not judging, I'm not criticizing, I'm observing. He's carrying a couple of plastic, short duration plastic containers that are going to be, also would have had that same trajectory. And that teddy bear, so I think people are at some point going to say, so all of this stuff was made with petrochemical products that they were so abundant, they were used with such sort of freedom and lack of thought. Someday that's going to seem like a very strange, surreal kind of a thing, I think.
Yeah, maybe that will be the iconic type of thing that that people just won't really understand. Like, were people walking around with these things all the time? And
exactly,
that's the history that's there. And to us now, we're like, oh yeah, that's the Stampede.
Exactly.
It makes sense. But yeah, that's such an interesting perspective that you have on it, because I mean, in your work, because you have had a few decades under your belt of photography and putting these publications together, you've actually seen the reality of that come into play, where something does become that piece of history.
Yeah, I think that's true, Evelyn. And again, that there was none of this in my mind when I was shooting the image. I was attracted, just as you were, with the graphic potentiality of it and the color. But yeah, with the passage of time, some other things have been suggested to me, and that might continue to be the trajectory of that photograph as time goes forward.
Yeah, we have a great comment here from Jenny in the chat, and I again want to encourage everyone to participate in the chat. But Jenny says, there's so many great photographers are intensely empathetic. For me, photography is a vulnerable experience shared between photographer and subject, whether the subject is a person, nature, or other.
I think that's just, I think that's really true. I mean, photography is a big thing. There's lots of different approaches and that photographers take. But I would agree, Jenny, the photographers that I'm really moved by you've nailed it. It's that capacity to connect on some kind of intimate, personal level or spiritual level with a person or a place that I just find absolutely irresistible. And it's of course exerted a very, very powerful influence and inspiration on my own work. So you're absolutely right about that from my perspective.
Wonderful. All right, so the next couple of photographs here, again, are, I believe, in the 2000s. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but we have a downtown image here. I think it was 2013. There's a couple different things going on with this photograph. Could you maybe explain what was happening when you photographed this one?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I thought, it's this sort of kaleidoscopic quality that you get when you're on the streets. Of course, you've got the neon sign and the reflection of the neon sign on the right 2/3 of the frame. And then there's just this kind of unsettling sort of narrative element of this woman who briefly walked into frame, looked up, saw me just as I was taking the photograph. And there's something about the interplay between the static and the constantly moving ephemeral aspects of the city, which is enormously interesting when you're out photographing, because it's just this utterly, constantly changing little sort of a palette of options when you're photographing. Also, of course, if you look at it graphically, it's this wonderful little interplay between the left third, which is kind of like a vertical aspect ratio uncropped image, and then the right 2/3 are like a perfect square that you might get off of a Hasselblad camera. So one of the things that I do when I photograph, and this is again an inspiration from photographers like Cartier-Bresson, is the idea of not cropping. It's not that I don't ever crop. I'd sometimes do a small amount of cropping on images or a little bit of perspective correction, but the photographs are largely, and in most cases, completely captured in the moment in which the photograph is made. So there's this really interesting aesthetic challenge and game that's part of street photography. It's, you got the box, you got the shape that you're working in, and then there's all of this continually moving, changing, tumbling reality, which is a reality of both of people and place. And so the chances of getting all of the things together all at once in a photograph, they're slim. So it makes the hunting for these things very interesting, because you look, you see things, and then you fail, and then once in a while you actually see it and you get it, and that's a good feeling.
Yeah, let's move on to the next photo here too, that had sort of a similar idea of using some of these different graphic elements and color. And then of course, I mean, these are, again, just fleeting moments of you capturing people on the street. You didn't set any of this up. You're photographing it very naturally. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the idea of street photography and photographing people just in their environment? Do you have any kind of ethics that you follow in that regard?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm respectful of the folks that I photograph, and I try to be very light on my feet when I'm photographing, so that I'm not being aggressive or ever disrespectful or ever photographing someone who was not okay with being photographed. If I ever sensed that I was being, or that if somebody ever said, I don't want you to photograph me, of course I'm going to respect those things. I can answer the question sort of briefly. Within the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and also within something called the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, it's like legal for photographers to engage in what we refer to as editorial or journalistic or documentary photography. But it can be done with affection and a lightness of touch, or it can be done aggressively and disrespectfully. And, I think that I always have a sense that when I've been photographing in a place or I've been photographing a person, that if they're happy to see me come back, then I've conducted myself properly. If there's ever any tension or question about that or unhappiness, I'm going to, of course, try to rectify it, but that tells me that I've maybe stepped over a boundary. There is, of course, something really unique about a candid or a street photograph. You can't ever kind of like quite set them up and get the freshness and reality of a scene when you stopped it. And then, of course, there's sometimes these lovely little surreal moments. So if you look at this guy, he's standing, he's probably looking at his phone. But if you look at the little advertising sheets on the wall behind him, it looks like he's holding that bottle of wine or liquor, whatever it happens to be, sort of a thing. So it's something that it's just a nice little surreal moment in that the three-dimensional reality of that scene that we're looking at is transformed into a two-dimensional object, which appears to make it look as if he is holding the bottle, essentially, right? And of course, there's that wonderful color palette. You know, the magenta on the woman's shirt, the diagonal slash of the yellow moving through the frame. And so that makes it, you know, for me, kind of a charming little moment, you know, of along 7th Avenue in Calgary, essentially.
We have another comment here from Nigel Roberts, wondering about if your approach is to find the location and wait for something to happen, or if it's more spontaneous than that. So do you often say like, okay, today I'm going to go and wander this particular area, maybe you're seeking something out, or do you just always have a camera on you and wait for something to happen?
I almost never have a camera on me. Like virtually never, not even an iPhone most of the time, right? It's a very purposeful activity. And so, you know, I'll schedule a chunk of time, you know, and it's, there's different favorite times. I love Sunday mornings. I love summer and fall months and that sort of thing. But it's like on the calendar. It's okay, I'm going to go out and photograph. I'm leaving home at 9 tomorrow. I'm going to go to this part of Calgary. Or I'm leaving tomorrow at 9 and I'm going to spend the day with the Hutterites or whatever it might be. And again, I'm just going to speak for myself. There is some photographers, and I'm not one of them, think that if you have a camera with you and you're out living life and you see something, you can photograph it. I'm just not that sharp, right? I mean, I got to be really focused. And I think that the idea that you can be out somewhere and you can see well and importantly and deeply without a lot of intention, it just doesn't work for me. I mean, for me, it's a very, like the camera's packed, the film is in the thing, you know, everything is all gridded out. So I'm kind of like ready. And, you know, I've never actually thought about it, but now that that interesting question has been asked, it's probably a lot like when Bobby Orr used to lace on his skates with the Bruins, right? I mean, he knew he was going onto the ice at 7 o'clock. There was a mission. And interestingly, too, you know, the aspect ratio of an NHL rink is not unlike the aspect ratio of a 35 millimeter slide, right? So it's a very intentional activity. And the reason for that is because I think then there's some level of awareness and just receptivity to what might be out there that kind of, for me, aligns itself with the activity being more intentional.
So before we get to a few more photographs, I want to talk a little bit about the light. And one of the things that, I mean, I've always noticed about your photographs is that you tend to use natural light, and you have a very good way of finding these beautiful pockets of light. Actually, Chris Donovan and I, before the live stream started, we were chatting about just this collection of photos that we're going to look at here shortly. And we're always like, oh, the light in this photo, it's so great. Do you think that there's something special about the light that's in Calgary, and when do you kind of seek that out, or how do you seek that out?
Well, I really do, Evelyn. And you know, it's interesting, as you know, the word photography literally means writing with light. And you're absolutely right, because I don't use artificial light hardly ever in my documentary work. this is what I do. I decide I'm going to photograph the Hutterites or go to the First Nations Reserve or whatever it might be. And I get there, and if I find a subject and I find great light, then I'll take a photograph. If I find a great subject but there's no light, I won't. If I have great light and there's no subject, I won't photograph. So I'm really, in a sense, a very sort of a passive individual, in the same way that a camera sensor or a piece of film is a passive thing, right? Mm-hmm. It needs to be animated by, well, light, you know, light and some affection or attraction to the subject that I'm photographing. So I'm keenly aware of the quality of the light in the prairie provinces, and it's interesting. One of my other books I did with Rocky Mountain Books, it's a book called Prairie Gothic, and it's a favorite. Virtually every photograph in that book was shot on cloudy days. I was interested on that project in a very soft, light grayscale imagery. So I'd be out driving around, and if it was a sunny day, I'd take out the Kodachrome, and that got into Alberta book. If it was a cloudy day, I took out the Hasselblad, and that got into the Prairie Gothic book. So I'm very, 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 very much in tune with the light. And I appreciate the comment. I think the light is really quite exceptional in many of these photographs, but you know, God did the work. I just patiently awaited the opportunity to make the photograph. So it's the light is incredibly important to me, and because I work almost exclusively with natural light, I'm at the mercy of the elements and at the blessing of the good Lord to bring that to me.
Go. Well, let's pull up a couple photographs from one of my favorite series that you did. And we were chatting about how this was actually featured in a local publication that was part of the Calgary Herald, Swerve magazine, which no longer exists, sadly. But these photographs are from a place called Midfield, which was a trailer park in Calgary. So this first one, I think, again, talking about the light and the contrast of this sky, and to me this is like a summer sky in Calgary or in Alberta. Can you tell a little bit about this project?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, if somebody was to ask me what is the most interesting intersection in Alberta, I would nominate the intersection of Deerfoot Trail and 16th Avenue. The reason for that is, of course, 16th Avenue is the Trans-Canada Highway as it passes through Calgary. That's our big east-west national highway. Deerfoot is our main, hooks in essentially into Highway 2, the main north-south highway, which connects, you know, ultimately places like Edmonton, Calgary to the U.S. border, and that essentially. And right on the intersection of those two iconic highways sat this place called the Midfield Mobile Home Park. And I did some photography there. I also, at a later date, collaborated with a beloved friend of mine. I hope she's watching tonight, Laura O'Grady, who did an incredible documentary on the Midfield Mobile Home Park. And it was, again, one of these stories. You know, Laura's got a big heart. I've got a slightly big heart, but she's got a huge heart, right? And we were both really attracted to the idea of the vulnerability of this community. These people had lived in Midfield Mobile for many years. And as happens in big cities, you know, sometimes things have to change. You can't kind of lock down that particular piece of land and that particular intersection forever, you know, in support of a small mobile home park. And so both of us went in there, Laura with her great cinematographer, Patrick McLaughlin, and me with my Nikon and 35 millimeter lens, and we photographed the place. And we photographed the trajectory and the poignant trajectory of the lives of the people who'd called that place home, who were being displaced. And you may want to go to the
let's see the next photograph
I think
here.
there's another one. And this is a guy named Yves Drouin, if I'm not mistaken. He, you know, he was like a citizen, right? He was a Calgarian in the best sense of the word. First of all, he was from Quebec. He was from away. Secondly, he worked in the construction industry. He was a drywaller, right? And he and his wife had this mobile home in Midfield Mobile, right? And he was sort of like somebody you might expect to meet on the French Riviera. He was very articulate. He had a beautiful French accent. He was very handsome. He was beautifully tanned. And he brought all of that sensibility to this asphalt lane in the middle of the midfield mobile home park, essentially, right? And, you know, Laura and I happened to be there the same day. We met Eve, and he was okay with me while he was absorbing a little bit of Alberta sunshine there.
Fantastic. The next photograph here is going back a little bit in the earlier 2000s, and this was at the Ogden Legion. And this is, again, another one of those photographs where, I mean, the light in this photograph is hitting it so perfectly. And I believe, was this during a lot of the photography that you were doing for Last Call?
Yes.
For the hotels that you were speaking of?
That's right, Evelyn, yeah. This particular image wasn't specifically part of the Last Call book, but it was done at about the same time. And, you know, again, I think when I look at it, in some ways it's kind of just a, you know, just kind of a throwaway thing. It's a bar. But if you look at it a little bit more deeply, you'll see things like, you'll see ticket stubs from people playing, you know, the games. I can't remember the name, when they walk around and they sell you the tickets, and then they pick a ticket and somebody wins some money, kind of a thing. There's cigarettes in there, so there's people smoking, right? There's these iconic classic Canadian beer bottles. So in some ways, it's an interesting little document of these folks, these members of the Ogden Legion, which, as Calgarians know, is located in the eastern part of the city. It's no longer operating, you know. But the other thing that, when I look at this now, that I'm sort of struck by is that it really mirrors for me some of my really earliest recollections. When I was a boy, I grew up in Drumheller, and every Sunday my parents would march myself and my three sisters over to St. Anthony's Church, and we would sit there, and I would lean into my dad, kind of doze off, looking up at the stained glass window in St. Anthony's Church. And you know, there's something, and I don't think it's stretching things to say that these beer bottles are as beautiful as the stained glass in St. Anthony's Church. And that's the way it should be. I mean, there's nothing about a church that's any more sacred or any more beautiful or any more communal than this particular environment. And it is, you know, it's always been one of my favorite photographs. I think the light and the, you know, the almost sacred quality to those bottles backlit is really engaging and beautiful, I think.
Well, and just seeing there's a little bit of that smokiness in the photograph, and I mean, even just seeing the subtleties of the people in this photograph's body language, and yeah, I agree. I mean, there's something that's very beautiful out of something that, you know, inherently isn't necessarily a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
The last photograph we have in the selection before we get to some other questions, this is a photograph from 1989, which is actually around the time that I came into the world. And, you know, the fact that it is a billboard for film in itself, I mean, we're at the camera store. It's something that is very special and very fleeting, and something that you wouldn't see today.
Yeah, you know, I think it's quite lovely. You know, I mean, if you look at the billboard carefully, you know, now of course this message was crafted by an ad agency somewhere in the eastern United States, but it's absolutely, in spite of its origins, it's absolutely true. It says, "All that glitters is gold," right? And of course, it was a way of kind of highlighting and promoting this Kodak Gold 35 millimeter film. But you know, again, all that glitters, you know, light is the agency of photography. Things which glitter or are illuminated, those are all parts of you know, what animates photography. The other thing that I kind of enjoy about it, and I think it might be the last photograph in the book, if you look carefully, and I know you've got a good eye there, Evelyn, you'll see that it's actually a self-portrait, right?
Yes, I see
My
you in
shadow
that.
is on the right side of the frame, right? So it's a little acknowledgement of the great affection that I have for photography as a medium, how it's been such an important part of my life. You know, not to get too esoteric, but you know, as you know, I still buy film and darkroom supplies from you guys, right? Which I love spending time in my darkroom. So I love that legacy. But the important thing here is that, you know, all that glitters is gold. And of course, you know, arguably the most important photographs on some level are the photographs that people take of their families. Like I know
Yes.
you with your beautiful young daughter and son, right? I
Yes.
mean, you're doing it digitally now, but the idea of the family album, or you know, newer ways of sharing and collecting family histories, photography is still an incredibly blessed, sacred, utterly democratic medium that everybody can use, and it's been that way since the beginning, right? You know, we trace the invention of photography back to 1839, and shortly after it was invented, there was a photograph of a guy getting his shoes shined in Paris, which is the first known photograph of a human being. And all of those trillions of photographs that have been taken of adorable baby girls, especially like your daughter, those are some of our most treasured personal possessions for all of us.
Absolutely. And Liz made a very good comment in the chat, just saying how incredible it is to have how many sensory memories images evoke. And I mean, I think that's incredibly true, you know, especially when you can just see little hints of things from the past. It takes you back very quickly. And I agree that, you know, a lot of the most important images are the people that are in our lives, but then also I think the other things that are in our lives, like the places and the buildings and the things that you drive past and look at every single day, you know, they change, especially in a fairly young city like ours. It's constantly changing. And so it's so wonderful to be able to look back in a lot of your books, Borrowed Time, and some of your previous publications, because it's like looking back in a family photo album of our city.
Well, I love that, and you know, I love that comment, because of course I feel a great intimate connection with the city and a real awareness, I guess, of the passage of time. So, you know, I've never thought of it, but I think you said it eloquently there, Evelyn, that this is kind of a family album for me, and this is kind of my little piece of the world, and in that sense, it rivals the affection that I have for, you know, family and friends. That's absolutely true.
Gary Clennon, shout out to Gary, by the way, nice to see you in the chat tonight. He wants to know, what are some of the things you find help you get out of a slump? Also a little side note that A World Within is one of his favorite photographic books that you've ever published.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, and you know, you're actually addressing there, Gary, what might be the central question that I and people like me face in photography. What I need in order to engage in a photographic project is I have to really, really love it deeply. As you know, on average, I spend anywhere from 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40 years on these projects. So I better kind of, I better love them, or I'm just not going to be able to spend the time. But you don't get an infinite number of things that hold that level of attraction for you. So I'm sort of working simultaneously on a number of things while I'm photographing. The great Bill Brandt, the British photographer, I think answered that question more eloquently than anyone else for me. And he said that the key to a sustained career in photography and to creating great work is that you have to have one of two things happening. The first is the kind of the obvious one, and that is you have to really love something. You have to find a subject that engages you not only visually, but perhaps psychologically, spiritually, emotionally. It has to engage you on a lot of levels in the way that your spouse might engage you, perhaps. The other equally, I think, interesting and perhaps pricklier one is he said you have to find something that you're terrified of, right? And that's been a roadway to photographers like, say, Bruce Davidson, Deanne Arbus. It was a really important part for me when I was working on the project called Last Call. I was terrified. I was, that I was going to get thumped on, spat on, because I was in rough private territory where the drug and the sex trade was prolific, and they'd leave me wandering around there obliviously taking photographs or getting into rooms or getting into back parts of these hotels when I was photographing. I developed over the course of time a level of comfort, but it was heart-poundingly difficult when I first started walking into those places. But that powerful emotion that it engendered in me was, I think, it was difficult, but it was an important part of me engaging in that work. So, I think to stay inspired, you have to ideally find something that means a lot to you. You have to do it kind of for the right reasons, not maybe for an audience, but for yourself. And you also just sometimes it's a kind of a pushing through thing. Sometimes you set stuff aside for a while, and then see if you can re-engage with it. It's a gift. It's a blessing. It's not something that you just get and you have and it's there. It's something that has to continually be earned, reinforced, sustained, as all important relationships are.
There's a few more wonderful questions in the chat, but I'm just thinking about all of your projects and all of this work that you've done over many years, and as you say, sometimes putting some of these projects on hold and getting back to it maybe years later. Are you a very organized person in terms of how you archive your work and how you kind of categorize it even in your mind of what you actually have?
Yes.
I knew that. I actually knew that. But I just wanted to hear you say it.
But yeah, and
you're meticulous.
It's a blessing and a curse. I drive myself and my brothers especially crazy because I'm so anal about stuff. But yeah, I think it is a good idea, especially with digital, but and it's still an important part of my film work. But yeah. It's one of the things about photography that's kind of prickly and tricky is it's really easy to make photographs. It takes a little bit of organization to kind of keep them organized and to keep them in a way that you can find them and you can get back to them in the future. It's kind of like, the making is kind of the fun stuff. It's probably, heaven forbid I should say, that's probably like making babies, right? But it's yes. all those
it's
years.
It's your babies, your family albums.
Yeah. But it's all that time after the fun part, all the organizing, caring, structuring, all of that kind of stuff. Yes. That's kind of the parenting side of it, sort of thing.
You're raising your photographs by organizing them.
Yes, something like that.
And could you give us a little bit of insight of what that looks like? Is it a lot of note taking and what's the physical process look like for you?
Yeah, well, years ago when I started shooting film, and I keep contact sheets and negatives all together, and they're organized either by project or they're organized chronologically, and they're, if I had to find a particular image, it's not that I could find it immediately, but I could probably find it within a couple of hours, because the stuff is, it's chronological, it's by project and that sort of thing. Digital work is often organized either in project folders or that would kind of be the main thing, I think, the main way that I do it. So, and I don't shoot just gigantic numbers of photographs in the way that some people do. So it's a simple low-tech thing, but it's just based on, I shoot, I process, I caption, and then the stuff goes into the appropriate contact sheet folder or into the appropriate folder on the computer, and it's backed up many times. Hard drives here, there, in external,
yes.
archival DVDs.
I'm like, how is he pulling this stuff? And as you say, going back to projects, and so I find that that fascinating within your whole process. Yeah. We have a question here from Chris Malloy. So there's some really great people in the chat.
Chris, don't be kind to me, buddy.
Be kind to me. No, he has a great question, and I'm curious about this too. Mm-hmm. If there was one Alberta building structure or subject that has been demolished that you wish you could have photographed, what would it be? Did you miss out on something?
Yeah, some of you guys don't know Chris Malloy. Chris is an incredible photographer. Architecture is his métier. He's superb. So on some level, I'm afraid to tell him anything, right? Because he might go and photograph it. But I'm kidding. But based on the fact that something that's gone that I missed, man,
Or that you didn't just get the right photo of, maybe?
Yeah. That's such a good question, Chris. And I'm having a hard time pulling something quickly up. I guess, and it's partly because of my working process. And Chris, I follow his work, and we interestingly, just by chance, kind of crossed paths, not physically, but in terms of the places that we photographed in. I think he's a little more strategic. He's a better planner. He's a way more technically skilled photographer by miles than I am. So I think he kind of plans where he's going to go, and then he goes there, and then he makes a great photograph. I sort of wander around kind of obliviously and think, oh, gee, that looks like an interesting thing. I'm going to go over there and photograph. So my process is a much less efficient one. And it's based on kind of stumbling upon things, essentially, where I think his is a little bit more organized and directed. So I'm going to give that some careful thought, my friend, and if I can come up with the answer, I'm going to send you an email. But because I'm not really sort of planning to ever photograph any specific thing, and I just kind of stumble on them, I can't kind of give you a good answer this evening, but I'll give it some thought and get back to you if I can answer that for you.
Fantastic. And Alan made a comment just saying, is it fair to say that you have a special affection for working people and their surroundings?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And I think it has to do with several things. One of them is that most of these people that I photographed, I've spent some time with, and many of them have gone through challenging circumstances in their lives, and so their stories, especially some of the folks that I met, that were living in places like the Cecil and King 80 hotels, they went through some difficult and challenging times in their lives, and hearing their life stories, I felt great affection, I felt great respect, but perhaps even more important than that, a lot of these folks helped me to understand, how you get through difficult things, how you deal with challenge, how you overcome problems. And, I think that's something that we all need. I love the idea of storytelling as a way of inspiring and helping us in our lives, right? It's part of my Catholic tradition, and the important role that Scripture plays in those sorts of things. And the other thing I think is I find folks like that, working class folks, they tend to be a little bit less guarded. And I don't say this disrespectfully, but I think that people that when they gain a certain level of sophistication or education or suits or power and that sort of thing, they're much more sort of guarded and discreet, if I could use that word, about sharing intimately. And I find that there's something about regular folk, for want of a better descriptor, there tends to be a greater level of openness, and I'm really, really attracted to that. And there is something about just the circumstances of their lives that are, and the narratives of their lives that are often, I think, really deeply inspiring for me. And I just feel I've grown to have enormous affection and respect for some of these folks that have allowed me into their lives.
And I will tell you that your friend Laura O'Grady is watching tonight, and she's in the chat saying that you have a remarkable gift for gaining a deep trust with the subjects very quickly. Is there an individual or project that you hope to return to for another series?
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Laura. One of the real challenges, and we've all had challenges with COVID, obviously, and I'm having a happy night, so everybody think, I've had some pretty dark moments, just as everybody has over this last nearly 2 years. One of my deepest regrets was my regular visits with the Hutterites have been largely curtailed. And I got a lot of phone calls from one little guy named Ryan, who phoned me almost at one period almost weekly on Thursdays at 8 o'clock, for information on what was happening with COVID and when I was going to come out to visit and that sort of thing. And he's the son of a woman that I photographed when I was doing the book A World Within about the Hutterites. And I really want to start spending more time with the Hutterites again. And more of them are getting vaccinated. I'm getting my 3rd shot tomorrow. So I think that's going to potentially be safer. But they're such a, I love them, and they're continuing to renew, right? I was out there a couple of weeks ago, and I pulled in, and they were having a kind of a recess, right? So I pulled in, I stopped, I got out of my car, the kids all saw me, the teachers, and the kids all started chanting, "George Weber, George Weber." And the teachers thought, who'd never met me, were, wondering who I was, and that's, I just, I love to spend time with them. And because I'm now into about the 22nd year of photographing, and there's some things that I'd like to do with that next generation, like Ryan and the teenage boys especially, that when it's safe or safer, I'm certainly looking forward to spending more time with them. And of course, Laura, because you're here, projects like Midfield, of course, that we both worked on, those are very, very precious because, of course, there's no chance to ever go back there again as well, right? That's gone. Like what you have on tape and what I have in stills there's no way of ever reconnecting. So, and that's sadly, but commonly, the more common thing is that you don't have a second chance. With the Hutterites, I do, and I'm hoping to take advantage of that.
I think that's a really good message, George, for one of my final questions that I was going to ask you. And again, that ties back to the book and the title and how this was put together. But this book is titled Borrowed Time. And I think you've touched on it, but can you kind of go into a little bit more detail of why it was titled Borrowed Time?
Well, I think all photographs, in a sense, are borrowed time. Like what you're doing is life is moving by. You're kind of capturing or holding something, but of course you can't really. Things like I don't like change. I'm really bad about that, and so it's not a good quality. Like I'm not that adaptable or flexible, or I'm not a great adopter of new things. But that's sort of the way I am. And photography is a way of sort of holding on, borrowing, holding, retaining. But of course, ultimately, it's always doomed to failure. The other thing, if I was thinking about this, because as it relates to the city of Calgary, when we came to Calgary in 1960, it was a city of about 200,000. And the entire arc of my life and my sister's life, oops, which am I pointing here, has been, we got to go to live in a great middle-class community, go to a great high school, go to a great university here. We all got jobs in healthcare or creative industries or real estate or whatever it might be. And all of that was, of course, the foundation for all of that was the great blessing of the hydrocarbon, the petrochemical industry, all of the things that brought to Calgary in terms of financial and human capital and the like. We are kind of in a time now where that legacy of the hydrocarbon being the driving engine for world economies and a really important part of Calgary's economy is kind of, it's transitioning into something different. And it's not that things are going to just go bad here, but in a sense, in some of my dark moments, I wonder, have we been, or were we, in a sense, living on kind of borrowed time? We had all of these blessings. We kind of took them for granted. We didn't really reflect on the ephemerality of them. And so perhaps we could say that we were on borrowed time. Now, on a really personal level, like I keep saying here, I'm going to be 70 in February. Like I'm on borrowed time.
Well, I think that this is one of my favorite books that you have put together so far. And I'm wondering, is there any significance to the specific range of years, 1976 to 2019?
Yeah, there is actually. So 1976 was kind of when I started doing photography. So
Okay,
I couldn't
the
go
beginning.
back. I couldn't go back any further. And when we were doing the final layout and editing for the book, we sort of thought, because I did do photographs in 2020 and in 2021, and we could have put them into the book. But we sort of thought, yeah, this is a really interesting little. So the book goes from when I started to do photography until just before. Well, it goes right literally to the edge of when COVID was unleashed in the world, essentially, right? So it documents the social history, political history, architectural history of the city of Calgary up until this powerful demarcation point of COVID, essentially, right? So in that sense, it's a very sharply defined time range, defined by me picking up a camera and COVID being unleashed into the world and into Calgary, of course, as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I encourage everyone to get your hands on a copy. Make sure you come into the camera store. We have some that George actually spent a good afternoon with Riley from the TCSTV live team signing, I think maybe 100 copies or something like that. So we have these available signed copies. And for the book launch, for all of you, we have this 20% offer. We can ship across Canada. So please do make sure that you check it out on the camera store's website. But George, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, the camera store the opportunity to talk to you about this book. We could go on all night long if we could, but it's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Blessings, my friend. It's been a joy. Thanks, Evelyn.
Wonderful. And again, thank you to the Calgary Public Library, to Crystal for the introductions, and of course to the Rocky Mountain Book Publishing Company and the whole team that's been in the chat. We really appreciate you. And to the TCS TV Live Dream team, thank you again, and we hope to catch you all again very soon.